This is University Lecture. Welcome to another in a series of lectures given on the campus of Iowa State University in Ames. Today we present the second in a series of 8 lectures from the 1969 World Affairs Institute, the USSR, the Second Half Century. Today's speaker is Harry Schwartz, a member of the editorial board of the New York Times and a specialist in Soviet affairs, speaking on the Soviet economy since Khruschev. Mr. Schwartz.
Ladies and gentlemen, the trouble with very kind introductions, such as Professor Schwartz, who's no relative of mine, just gave me, is they remind me how old I'm getting to be. Imagine somebody who was old enough to be in the Army and be drafted, as a matter of fact, in World War II. But we used to have a lottery in those days, too, for the benefit of the younger generation. However, the topic assigned me this afternoon, is the economy of the Soviet Union, and it's going to be a sort of a dry speech, what was it they call economics? The dismal science. And so I'd like to just say a little bit impressionistically about the Soviet Union, about the way people live there. I am fairly unpopular in the Soviet Union, or at least among the officials of the Soviet government. I think I've applied most years in the past 20 years for a visa and have been refused almost every time. But through clerical error or some other reason, they slipped up twice in 1955 and 1968. And so my visual impressions of the Soviet Union go back to those 2 years, and I just simply like to share them very briefly with you. In 1955, which was a decade after the end of World War II, and really at the beginning of the Khruschev era, an American visiting the Soviet Union felt as though he were in a country which was very largely slum. And I mean this simply descriptively. It was an extremely poor country. It was a country which showed very visibly the continuing wounds of the enormous losses caused by World War II. The people were poorly dressed, the housing was abominable, the streets had very little in the way of automobiles, although they had lots of trucks in them. It was a terribly depressing place from the economic point of view in 1955. Well, as I say, having written that essentially, when I got back from Russia in 55, they didn't let me in for a good many years. You've got to understand that if you meet someone, a journalist particularly, who has easy access to the Soviet Union, that means that what he's writing pleases the authorities in Moscow. But at any rate, they finally let me in 1968, and that only by virtue of the fact that I got onto the Pan Am flight, which was beginning the direct New York to Moscow service, the VIP flight with all the big publishers and other important people, including Chip Bolin, who spoke here last night on that flight. And so for them to have thrown me off would have made a little unfavorable publicity. But at any rate, I must say that the economic gains between 1955 and 1968 were very, very substantial. And I've always wondered at the stupidity of the Soviet government, which might have been nice, and just sort of let me wander around for a couple of weeks, and then I would simply have had to write, that they've made enormous gains, enormous strides. Instead of that, of course, they were characteristically bitchy. They'd given me a 3-day visa, and I asked for an extension. They said, "Niet." As a matter of fact, I got a refusal within 2 hours. When any bureaucracy can give you a refusal with 2 hours, they anticipated the question, anticipated the answer. So that I want to stress, however, that when I talk about the enormous economic gains the Soviet Union made between the mid-50s and the present period, that these are relative gains within themselves. That is, the Russia of 68 and presumably of 69 is a much richer place than the Russia of 1955. There should be no question of it. But I should also add that by American standards, it is still a very dreary place. Now, there are now very pleasant features of Moscow, for example. A lot of very fine new buildings, good-looking new buildings. The people are better dressed, etc. But again, we've moved ahead too. And I must confess that neither in 55 nor in 68 did I feel that for material reasons, or any other for that matter, that I want to exchange my American citizenship for the Soviet citizenship. And so what I'm really trying to say is that the Soviet Union and the Soviet people have made major gains, but that by comparison really with the rest of the Western world, which has also been making gains over this period, the Soviet people are still, I think we can put it very simply, that they are the poorest in terms of standard of living of any of the peoples living in a major Western industrial nation. And that, of course, by no means denies the fact of very, very great and very substantial progress. But so much for, that's sort of the reporter in me coming out. I felt that I ought to say something about what I'd seen with my own eyes rather than just confine my talk to what one gets from misspent years reading Pravda and Izvesty and Planovoye Khozyastva and Ekonomicheskoye Gazeta and similar publications. Let's go back 5 years. You realize Khrushchev was removed about 5 years and 7 weeks ago, October 14th, 1964 to be precise. And he was removed for many reasons. The Pravdas talk about sort of harebrained scheming, which is what they characterize the Khrushchev era as, applied to many areas of Soviet life, but it certainly applied to Khrushchev's last years in the economic sphere. And Khrushchev's dominance of the Soviet economy really broke down into two periods, because in the late 1950s, the Soviet economy did move ahead very, very rapidly. As a matter of fact, when I saw it in 55, it was really at the beginning of a major takeoff. And the older people here will recall that in the late 1950s, the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, the late Allen Dulles, was acting as a kind of Paul Revere throughout the country, going around the nation making speeches saying, watch out, beware, warning, the Russians are moving ahead very rapidly, and while we're stagnating, and if we don't watch out, the Russians will beat us economically. And those of you who remember when Nikita Khrushchev was here in 1959, including, I believe, in Ames, Iowa, certainly I was with him at Roswell Garth's farm, which isn't very far away from here, his constant theme was that we shall bury you, but not by force of arms, by showing that our system is better economically, that we can outproduce you. And he had warrant, because the late 1950s were years of very rapid Soviet progress, at the same time that the United States was in sort of the Eisenhower stagnation period in terms of economic growth. Unfortunately for Mr. Khrushchev, in the early 1960s, just about everything went wrong economically that could have gone wrong. And industry slowed down very, very perceptibly, the growth of industry. Agriculture first stagnated, and then in 1963 had a total catastrophe in which the Soviet government was able to feed its people only by virtue of very large purchases of grain from the United States, Canada, and Australia. And there used to be jokes in the Soviet Union about what a miracle man Khrushchev was, because he planted grain in Siberia and European Russia, and then he harvested it in Canada and Iowa. Things like that. What I'm getting at is that Khrushchev had a series of failures. The Central Intelligence Agency was able to make some propaganda by issuing a report pointing out that in the early 60s, the United States was actually moving ahead more rapidly than the Soviet Union was. And there was the famous comment by Professor Aganbegyan, who is one of the most brilliant Soviet economists, actually Soviet econometricians, that the only decent report in the world on the Soviet economy was the CIA report, which said that. He's still alive and free and well, Mr. Agambegian, but I guess he was wise in making what was essentially an anti-Khrushchev crack shortly before the end of Khrushchev's reign in power. And Khrushchev really didn't know what to do because he sort of, as you looked at him floundering in those years, he was sort of like a boy out of his depth. He tried to solve his problems by administrative reorganization after administrative reorganization. For anybody in economics or political science trying to keep tabs in the Soviet Union is absolutely bewildering, because every 6 months or a year, you'd get a completely new organization chart. And I suppose the bewilderment reached its peak in 1962, when Mr. Khrushchev decided to abolish the Communist Party and institute 2 communist parties. And there was an agricultural communist party and an industrial communist party. And his argument was that under the existing system of one party, what it meant was that in the summertime, the officials all paid attention to agriculture and neglected industry, and in the wintertime, they all emphasized industry and neglected agriculture. And so both the fields suffered. Now, by having an agriculture communist party and an industrial communist party, why, you'd have officials who'd pay attention to each field 12 months during the year. Well, as I say, we were aware in the United States that those of us who had the bad luck to have to try to follow these things were constantly confused. We later discovered, of course, that the people who had to live in this system, that is, the people of the Soviet Union, particularly the officials of the Soviet government and the officials of the Soviet Communist Party, were even more confused. And you can imagine the kind of bureaucratic infighting and absolute chaos the existence of 2 communist parties led to. Really fantastic. But we can sum up Nikita Khrushchev's his dreams, by simply citing 3 major predictions that he made. And they sort of summed up his utopian view of the future and what Pravda meant by his harebrained scheming. And the 3 predictions Mr. Khrushchev made were, first of all, I'm talking about 1959 and the early 1960s, he said that by 1965, the communist nations of the world, which embrace about 1/3 of all humanity, would be outproducing industrially the 2/3 of the world that live under capitalist regimes. By 1965. His second prediction was that by 1970, the Soviet Union would be outproducing the United States both on a per capita basis and in terms of total production. And then finally, his third prediction, which is enshrined in the so-called third program of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, adopted in 1961 at the 22nd Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, was that by 1980, the Soviet Union would have achieved such incredible abundance of material production that the Soviet Union would be on the threshold of full communism. As a matter of fact, the third program of the Soviet Communist Party, adopted in 1961, ends with a ringing statement that the present generation shall live to see communism a reality. That's not quite it, but that's the general sense of the declaration. Well, here we are in prosaic 1969. And prediction number 1 obviously didn't work out. Neither in 1965, nor for that matter in 1969, as far as anybody can see for the indefinite future, have the communist nations of the world outproduced the non-communist nations of the world. Secondly, 1970 isn't upon us yet. It's always, theoretically possible. There might be a devastating depression in the United States next year, etc. But anyway, barring anything devastating, and I really don't expect it, and don't know anybody else who expects it, it's quite clear that in 1970, the United States will continue to be, as it has been for many years, far ahead of the Soviet Union in terms both of total production and of per capita production. And as far as 1980 goes, well, that's a long way off, but all I can say is that this prediction about being on the threshold of communism by 1980 has become sort of an unprediction. Nobody talks about it anymore. You know, it's like the uncle who had to be incarcerated in the lunatic asylum. He exists, but you don't talk about him. And similarly, this prediction goes. So that the Soviet leaders have come to terms with the fact that Khrushchev was wrong, and it's rather interesting that if you read the speeches of Mr. Brezhnev and Mr. Kosygin, Mr. Polyansky, the other top leaders in the Soviet Union today, they are very sober speeches, and one of the things they do not do is to talk about defeating the United States economically in any foreseeable near-term time span. Most of the time, they just ignore the subject. Occasionally, as in Mr. Kosygin's speech at the 23rd Party Congress in 1966, they do mention it, but in such an indefinite context that nobody can hold them up to a time schedule. Sometime, somehow, someplace. Now, it's quite clear that the present leadership, which is a very unglamorous, uncolorful, bureaucratic, but hard-working and sober leadership, took a very hard look at the Soviet economy when they took over in October 1964 and came to grips promptly with the fact that Mr. Khrushchev had made a mess of things and that there were a great many problems that needed solving. Matter of fact, some of their very first moves were economic in nature. For example, within a matter of days after Khrushchev's ouster, for example, Mr. Khrushchev's prohibitions against private agriculture. He had sought to wipe out, as far as he could, the collective farmer's right to have a little patch of ground, a garden of his own, maybe raise a cow or a pig or some chickens. Well, that kind of restriction was lifted almost immediately after Khrushchev was removed. And what the Soviet government was actually saying, of course, was that the food situation of the country, the food needs of the country was so urgent that the government really wasn't terribly particular as to whether the food was produced on the socialist agriculture, that is on the collectivized acres, or in the private sector of Soviet agriculture. They just wanted the food. And so in a sense, if you will, the private enterprise energies of Soviet collective farmers were unleashed. I repeat, within a matter of days of Khrushchev's ouster, and the importance attached to it is indicated by the fact that the announcement was really made by an article in Pravda by Peter Shelest, who was then and is now the first secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party, and certainly one of the half-dozen most important leaders in the Soviet Union today. Just within a month after Khrushchev's ouster, they abolished the two communist party system and went back to the one communist party system. And of course, revealed obliquely but rather clearly that Khrushchev had caused bureaucratic chaos by this idea of an agricultural communist party and a industrial communist party. Then, in March 1965, we have Mr. Brezhnev's very important and even historic speech in which he outlined agricultural policy. And the essence of Mr. Brezhnev's agricultural policy was a recognition that in order to get more production from Soviet farms, he had to do at least two things, both of which he promised. The first was to raise the prices the Soviet government paid farmers, which they did. And the second was to inaugurate a very ambitious program of capital investment in Soviet agriculture, in irrigation projects and making available tractors and harvesters and livestock machinery, et cetera, et cetera. And so you had the recognition that agriculture could not be increased simply by making speeches at the farmers, which often seemed to be Mr. Khrushchev's technique, but by investing large additional resources and providing large new incentives for the collective farmers. And then, of course, in September 1965, you have Mr. Kosygin's very important speech outlining the economic management reform of the Soviet economy, about which I will talk later. But let's, having tried to set this background of a new leadership that came in 5 years ago, recognized the economy was in trouble, recognized that changes should be made, and by the way, I would suggest that one of the changes that was made, and a very important one, although it wasn't announced at the time, must have been a very substantial cutback in the Soviet space program. I think there are clear hints in one or two speeches of Mr. Kosygin in late 1965 that he was not enamored of the space program as Khrushchev was, and that he thought there was better use for the scarce capital that was going into the space program. And so it's at least conceivable, and I can't prove this, but it's sort of my hunch that one of the reasons we got to the moon first was that the Kosygin-Brezhnev leadership at the end of 64, early 65, cut back the Soviet space program. Now, what have been the results? In other words, putting it another way, what has happened quantitatively to the Soviet economy in the past 5 years? Well, I think there's no question but that there has been very substantial and very impressive growth. If you will, one can say that they got the Russian economy moving again. They broke it out of the stagnation or worse in which it seemed caught in the last years of the Khrushchev era. I don't want to bore you with a lot of statistics, but I think we can say very roughly and very globally that over the past 5 years, based upon Soviet claims, and I think perhaps they need some discounting, but on an order of magnitude basis, where let's not worry about an extra 5% plus or minus, but on an order of magnitude basis, the leadership of the Soviet Union now claims, in terms of their official statistics, that industrial production has grown about 50% in the past 5 years, and agricultural production has grown roughly in the same order of magnitude. This year, agricultural production is down because of bad weather, but they had very good harvests in 1966, 67, and 68. Particularly 66 and 68. So overall, we can think of a 50% increase in 5 years in industrial and agricultural production, which is a very substantial growth. Of course, these measurements of total production are always difficult, so let me just cite one or two figures to indicate some of the reality behind it. In electricity, for example, the Soviet Union in 1964 produced 459 billion kilowatt hours. This year, Mr. Podgorny, the president of the Soviet Union, predicted the other day they'll be producing about 690 billion. Well, that's a 50% increase roughly in 5 years. In oil, they went from 224 million metric tons of oil in 1964 to about 329 million this year, almost 50%. And in steel, they've gone from about 85 million tons of steel and produced in 64 to about 110 million tons, and that's about a 1/3 increase in that time. So this is really very substantial. And so what we're dealing with, in effect, is a Soviet economy which is now quantitatively larger, produces more, has more capital equipment available, and the like, than any other time in its history. And by and large, I should think that along with that goes the likely fact that in the last year or two, the Soviet people have probably had the highest standard of living in their history. I repeat, it's a standard of living which far above what they had in the past by Western standards or even by Eastern European standards. In the summer of '68, I went within a week from Moscow to Bucharest to Prague, and I think even the improved Moscow standard of living was not very impressive, certainly in relation to the Prague standard of living, and even not impressive in relation to the Bucharest standard of living. But nevertheless, within the Soviet framework, they almost certainly have enjoyed in the last year or two the highest standard of living in the history of the Russian people. Now, they've not only done that, of course, in terms of overall economic gains, they have also done a few other things which are worth mentioning. For one thing, of course, there is now a new emphasis, or emphasis is the wrong word, there is now greater attention being paid to consumer goods. And in the last several years, the annual economic plans have for the first time provided for a somewhat larger percentage gain in consumer goods production than in the production of the means of capital goods. Putting it very inaccurately and loosely, they've been trying to increase light industry, consumer goods industry, a little more rapidly than heavy industry. Now, of course, one has to remember the background, that the background for this is some 30 years or so, 40 years really, of constant emphasis on heavy industry, so at the present time, 75% of Soviet production is still heavy industry. Consumer goods industry of the Soviet Union is still very much the junior brother. But nevertheless, it is interesting that whereas 5 years ago, 7 years ago, it was argued that there was the Leninist law, and of course the word Leninist is, you might say, is like the biblical law. Having abolished a supernatural god, they now worship a dead man, Lenin. And so the Leninist law, so-called, that the heavy industry had to increase more rapidly every year than light industry. Well, that Leninist law, quote-unquote, has been quietly laid to rest, and it has now been made respectable in some years to increase consumer goods production more rapidly than heavy industry production. Now, this should not be misunderstood. It's certainly true the Soviet Union is now producing more shoes, more television sets, and more refrigerators, more washing machines, etc., than ever before in its history. But at the same time, I think it ought to be borne in mind the Soviet Union has also been producing in recent years what, in my judgment, and I confess that this is a very difficult area because the Soviet Union does not publish many statistics for obvious reasons. My own feeling is that as far as peacetime is concerned, the Soviet Union has also gone in for record military production in recent years. I would point out that during the post-Khruschev era, we have seen a fantastic expansion of the Soviet Navy, made possible in large part by the appearance of many new Soviet warships, so that you now have a major Soviet Mediterranean fleet, which challenges the United States 7th Fleet in the Mediterranean. You now have Soviet fleet in the Indian Ocean, and just a few weeks ago, you had a Soviet naval vessel making a friendship visit to Havana, Cuba, which means, in effect, the appearance of a Soviet Atlantic fleet off, or what could become a Soviet Atlantic fleet off the shores of the United States. You've had in the past 5 years evidence of at least the beginning efforts of the Soviet Union to create an anti-ballistic missile system, probably prematurely, and apparently abandoned because it was realized it was technologically inefficient and obsolescent. And we certainly know that the Soviet Union has been experimenting, as have we, with MIRV rockets, that is, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, so that every missile you send up carries not one hydrogen bomb, but possibly 3, or maybe 10 or 20, who knows? Maybe someday somebody will make a missile that will carry enough hydrogen bombs to wipe out every city in the world. Who knows? Science is wonderful, and progress is being made all the time. But the point is that the Soviet Union has been moving ahead very rapidly in the military field. The difference, of course, is that nobody criticizes the Soviet military-industrial complex publicly in the Soviet Union, whereas in the United States, the poor people who, in the Joint Chiefs of Staff and in McDonnell Douglas or North American Rockwell, so see the world as full of enemies because nobody has a kind word to say anything for the American military-industrial complex. But the Soviet military-industrial complex has been doing very well indeed. Putting it another way, certainly the Soviet Union has been pressing ahead to build up its modern technological military might as rapidly as possible. And this, of course, implies the diversion from other purposes of enormous resources.
Simply saying that they've been very much in the arms race. Now, of course, I want you to understand why this has been true. It has not only been the traditional Soviet fear of and suspicion of the United States. And let's remember the past 5 years have been years of war in Vietnam, which could at least conceivably have spread.
Also, in the last 5 years, you've had tremendous enmity between the Soviet Union and China, enmity which culminated this year in a series of border clashes. Russians have killed Chinese, and Chinese have killed Russian this year, both along the Manchurian border and in Xinjiang. So the Russians have had to look forward in recent years to the possibility of a major war with China. And of course, last year, the Russians also had to look forward. The Russians must have decided to invade Czechoslovakia by the middle of the spring of 1968. They must have had to take account of the possibility that the invasion of Czechoslovakia would cause a world war, that the United States might react strongly to the invasion of Czechoslovakia. We didn't, of course, but they must have had to take that into account. At any rate, for all of these political and military reasons, it's quite clear that the Soviet production of arms, and of the most modern arms, has been pressed very insistently. And I would point out there has been no declaration from the Soviet Union in the past few weeks at all comparable to President Nixon's declaration a few days ago. President Nixon, remember, has declared the United States will never use bacteriological weapons, even if attacked by them, and has announced that the United States is now beginning to destroy its bacteriological weapons in being. And that particular portion of his statement was simply ignored in Pravda. So I think we must assume that the Soviet Union is still pressing ahead with chemical and bacteriological weapons, as well as with nuclear and other weapons. Okay, so they've made a lot of progress, but they've also got a lot of problems. And just to indicate one of them, there is now an extremely tight labor situation in the Soviet Union. Particularly in the major cities, such as Moscow and Leningrad. And this labor shortage is particularly acute, of course, in the areas of Siberia where the richest Soviet resources are now located and where they would like to make the most rapid development, not least because the more population and industry you have out in Siberia, the stronger that area is to meet a possible future Chinese challenge. And there are some signs in industry and other fields that a slowdown effect is again beginning to be felt, just as Khruschev felt at the beginning of the 60s. But let me turn now, because my time is growing short, to sort of the most important single change within the Soviet economy in the past 5 years. And it's a change which is basically still in its early stages, which is still being fought, which is slow, but which raises new perspectives. And that, of course, is the new economic management program, the Kosygin plan, announced in September 1965, and which has been in process of implementation. One has to remember, of course, that historically the Soviet Union became enamored of essentially the Stalinist centralized economic planning. That is, the traditional idea of the way a socialist economy, certainly in the Soviet Union, should be conducted, was in terms of a brain, the Gosplan, or Central Planning Committee, State Planning Committee in Moscow, laying down a blueprint for the entire economy for the year ahead or the 5 years ahead or whatever the period was, handing down orders to all the links in the economic chain, which then had only the job of fulfilling it. Well, that model of centralized economic planning had been proved many years ago in the West, curiously, as being a very inefficient mechanism for directing an economy. People like von Mises and Hayek and Frederick Taylor, who was once a professor of economics at the University of Michigan, and Oskar Lange and others, had shown that that kind of central planning in a socialist economy was really a case of the blind leading the blind, and inevitably led to vast inefficiencies. This is fascinating because I remember reading these articles and these books back in the 1930s and wondering what these guys were saying and how they could be talking this way when obviously the Soviet Union was moving so rapidly ahead. And yet, of course, what we've seen in the past few years with the adoption of what is called Liebermanism, although that's a misnomer really, is a kind of vindication of the predictions of these really mostly rather conservative Western economists who saw the deficiencies of the central planning schema. At any rate, with the realization, because of Khrushchev's failures, the Soviet Union could no longer go on trying to expand production primarily by emphasis upon just pouring in more resources. The Stalin-Khrushchev technique of increasing production was essentially based upon putting in more labor, more capital, more land, pouring in more and more resources. And of course, as long as you had rich unemployed resources to pour in additionally, this could and did get results. In a very fundamental sense, the decision taken by the Kosygin-Brezhnev leadership was that the Soviet Union had to go in for an intensive kind of growth rather than an extensive type of growth. Or putting it another way, that it had to focus primarily upon getting greater efficiency of the utilization of resources. And so the beginnings of this effort are reflected in the new economic mechanism, which is still, at the present time, only a very feeble compromise. That is, it is a compromise between the central planning instincts of most of the Soviet bureaucracy, which knows only the old way and sees no reason to change the old way. After all, they were trained and grew up in the old way. Why change things? And sort of a younger generation of economists, of whom Yevsey Lieberman of Kharkov is the one who's gotten the most publicity, but there are a lot of other people involved, which in effect understands that from the point of view of socialism itself, that the only way to get an efficient socialist economy is to adopt a system of market socialism. I dare say that some of the Soviet economists understand that eventually they're going to have to go over to some variant of the Yugoslav system of market socialism, but of course this is something they don't talk about too much publicly. But at any rate, what is the essence of the new system? The new system is not a return to capitalism. I mean, there is just such idiocy written about this, and here we have a kind of united front between very conservative commentators in the Soviet Union and the United States who wish the Soviet Union would return to capitalism, and the Chinese who, of course, find it convenient for their own purposes to charge the Soviet Union has returned to capitalism. So let me say it being, the Soviet Union has not returned to capitalism and has no intention of doing so. There is not going to be any Moscow Stock Exchange in the foreseeable future, no private ownership of capital, etc. And the Wall Street Journal need not worry about starting a Moscow edition. But what there is taking place is the beginning of the adaptation of certain market economy techniques which have historically been identified with capitalism, but which we know are not necessarily linked at all to the nature of the ownership of capital. Number one, of course, the Soviet Union has now gotten away from the idea that the only goal of production is a quantitative goal. In the Stalin-Khrushchev scheme, people were told to produce as much as possible. They were set a quantitative goal, and then if they produced more than the qualitative goal, they got very good bonuses. Quantity was all. And what was wrong with that scheme, of course, was that if you reward people for producing quantity, they will produce quantity. But quantity doesn't imply quality. Quantity doesn't even imply that what you've produced has any use whatsoever. And if one of the things that Brezhnev and Kosygin discovered when they took over from Khrushchev was that Soviet warehouses were simply piled high with several $1 billion worth of goods which had been produced, for whose production people had been paid and even given bonuses, but which nobody wanted to buy. So what use is something nobody wants to buy? So they held the world's greatest cut rate sale, cutting the prices 50% or more to get rid of the junk. So that one important element of the reform is that now Soviet managers are rewarded not for production, but for sales. In other words, it's now recognized in the Soviet Union that the utility of production is decided by a crucial test. Can you sell it to somebody? In a sense, you see, we can say that what they've learned is that the old socialist slogan is quite wrong. The old socialist slogan used to be, under socialism we have production for use rather than for profit. And that sounds great, doesn't it? But it took almost 50 years of the existence of the Soviet Union for somebody to discover that there had to be some means of figuring out whether what you had produced had any use. And what the new economic mechanism in the Soviet Union testifies to is that they've finally understood that the only way in which you really decide whether what's been produced has any use is whether you can sell it at a profit. In other words, you can only make a profit by producing things for use. But at any rate, the sales rather than production are now the basic criterion. And along with that, of course, is the fact that the whole concept of profit, and profit used to be about the dirtiest word in the Soviet vocabulary. Profit was what the capitalists squeezed out of the blood of the working class. Profit is now respectable. And as a matter of fact, not just profit in an absolute sense, but rate of return on investment. These days, you read a technical Soviet economics article about the allocation of investment and so on. It sounds as though you're reading your latest special from your friendly Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner, and Bean. In the sense that the Russians have finally understood that it is return on invested capital, which is a very crucial variable in running any economy rationally. And so now managers in the Soviet Union are rewarded for getting a better return on invested capital, because capital is scarce and you've got to use it efficiently. I would say these are the two key features of the change. The emphasis on sales, so that managers know they've got to produce something which people want, which can serve needs, not just produce for the sake of piling it up in the warehouse. And the second is that profit is now respectable and is now understood that you've got to try to use capital rationally. And the only way you can decide how to use capital rationally is by considering return on invested capital, or prospective return on the next marginal unit of capital invested. Along with that, of course, goes the idea that managers must have much more freedom, that the planners in Moscow, or lower down the line, must give only general directives. They must not try to bind every manager hand and foot. They must not try to foresee everything, to order everything, etc. Well, this system has been introduced. Most Soviet factories by now have shifted to it. It's being spread in construction, on the state farms, and so on. But it's quite clear that a battle royal is going on about this. And probably the battle royal extends up to the Politburo. But it's certainly going on at lower levels. Because you have a great many Soviet people who really believe, honestly, that this system is essentially capitalism. That the only true socialism is that which they had when the Gus Plan ruled everything 10 or 20 years ago. They believe that the young economists who are spark-plugging this and who want even more radical reforms are really revisionists. And by the way, this opinion must have support at a very high level, because those of you who followed Czechoslovak events last year know that in the Soviet indictment of the Dubček regime in Czechoslovakia at the time of the invasion, one of the key features of that indictment was precisely the charge that the economic reform in Czechoslovakia under Otto Schick was a return to capitalism. It was terribly ironic. You had the situation of the Chinese charging the Russian economic reform was a return to capitalism, and the Russians charging the Czechoslovak economic reform was a return to capitalism. Meanwhile, in Budapest, the Hungarians were sitting proudly telling anybody who wanted to listen to them that they had the most radical economic reform of all, but nobody said anything about them, because, of course, their troops invaded Czechoslovakia along with the Russians. At any rate, there are now new opportunities in the Soviet Union for running a rational economy, for improving productivity, and for minimizing at least ways of economic thought between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's quite clear now that the Soviet Union regards as really the real secret weapon of the United States, not hydrogen bombs and not guided missiles, but the Harvard Business School. And of course, Columbia, et cetera, and if you, the whole business school atmosphere. If I may put it in the jargon of the current day, the Soviet Union is becoming extremely square. Extremely square. They want to make profit. They think you've got to teach managers about linear programming and game theory, et cetera, et cetera. They're about 20 years behind the United States. As usual, it is a confused situation. They may continue on this line of the economic reform Certainly the mathematical economists, the econometricians in the Soviet Union have never had it so good. Input-output is almost a religion in some sections of the Soviet intelligentsia. On the other hand, there is a vast bureaucracy which thinks all these newfangled ideas are really proof of the effectiveness of capitalist propaganda. No doubt were all transmitted through the Voice of America and Radio Liberty broadcast to the Soviet Union. So this battle goes on. So let me sum up by saying that in the 5 years since Khrushchev, the Soviet Union has made great material progress, but the Soviet Union is still poor. Particularly its standard of living is still poor relative to the rest of the industrialized world. Point number two, that there has been more inflexibility introduced into the Soviet economy because of the economic reform. And I think it's very hard to decide where they're going to go, whether they're going to go back to the old system or move toward more of the Yugoslav market and the socialist market mechanism. But there's a battle at least going on. Thirdly, I would add that it is quite clear that the Soviet people expect an even more rapid increase in their standard of living in the future. I think the most important single project in the Soviet Union from the point of view of the mass of the Russian people is the Togliatti automobile plant, which is being built on the shores of the Volga, and where, whenever it's done next year or the year after, will after a while be producing 600,000 Fiats a year. Russia is on the verge of entering the automobile age. Those lucky people, in a few years, they're going to have traffic cops, pollution of the air by gasoline, flat tires, neon signs over gasoline stations. As I said, they're 20 years behind us. They didn't know how lucky they were. The point is that a terribly square country. They want all of the things we have, all of the things which the New Left and the hippie culture in the United States reject. Really, it's mid-Victorian capitalism come to life again under the banners of Marx and Lenin. Thank you very much.
During the discussion period, Mr. Schwartz was questioned further on his view that the Soviet people, in their desire for affluence, will repeat our mistakes.
I wasn't trying to denounce the Soviet Union. All I can tell you is that my contacts with Soviet citizens in the Soviet Union, my reading of Soviet publications, I have a misspent adulthood. I've spent the past 25 years worrying about the Soviet Union. That's what's worse than if I'd spent 25 years playing billiards or something. And all I can tell you is that that's a very hungry people for the material goods. They remind me of nothing more than the kinds of Americans I knew in the 1930s at the depth of depression. They have sacrificed for 2.5 generations for material abundance. And now they begin to see that around the corner, and that's what they want. And I don't blame them. They want a good life. They want to be well-fed, well-clothed, well-housed. They want to have transportation. They want all of the things we used to do until this new generation, which born and raised under affluence, thinks affluence is unimportant and throws it away.
The listener pointed out many intellectuals in the Soviet Union are anxious to avoid some of our mistakes and asked Mr. Schwartz whether he thought this might be possible.
Well, this is a judgmental thing. I don't see the future any more clearly than anybody else, but having been looking at the Soviet Union and watching them make successes and make mistakes, my guess is they're going to repeat a great many of our mistakes. After all, Khruschev did try, for example, to avoid the automobile mistake. 10 years ago, he was talking about, gee, what a terrible, wasteful thing it is for everybody to have an automobile which stands idle most of the time. He said, instead, he wanted to introduce the Hertz-Avis system, and he did for a while. He tried to get Soviet people to be interested in renting cars. They would just use the car when they wanted it, and so one car could serve more than one family. It was a bust. The Soviet people are very acquisitive, very greedy. They want me, gimme. They're no different than the people in the United States until the New Left and the sort of the young rejectors of affluence came along. So you ask my opinion, I don't think they're going to avoid our mistakes. They're polluting their country with insecticides, with industrial wastes. There seems to be a kind of law of industrial idiocy, which is independent of social systems, independent of whether you follow Adam Smith or Karl Marx. It just is a consequence. You want more. And the way you get more in a technological industrial society is you foul your environment. There's a kind of dialectic here. In getting more, you find out you end up by finally getting less. And I think they're going to go through the same cycle. Read the complaints of the Soviet intellectuals about what's being done to Lake Baikal by the paper production factories on its shore. The intellectuals chatter away, but nobody pays any attention to them over there any more than they paid attention to over here. If anything, since we're in a later point of the cycle, more attention is paid to them over here, and there's now a lot more activity on anti-pollution and environmental protection in the United States than there is in the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe.
Another member of the audience asked about employment. Does full employment mean underemployment?
I think the best answer to that is simply to say that the Soviet Union is a very large country whose area is something like 2.5 times the area of the United States. And as best as I can see it, the situation is a complex one, which includes at least 3 different levels that have to be taken into account. There are labor shortages in some of the chief industrial centers. I've mentioned Moscow and Leningrad. Now, there are Soviet economists, such as Alexander Bierman, for example, who insist that the labor shortage is a myth. All it proves is they're using the workers at such a low level of productivity. But at any rate, the official Soviet government position is there's a labor shortage, and what can we do about it? The second area, of course, are many of the middle and smaller-sized cities where economic expansion has not kept pace with the growth of population, or where economic development has been of one kind, so there may be, in one city like Ivanovo, a textile center, there may be jobs primarily for women, but no jobs for men, or very few jobs for men. Another place may be a heavy machinery center, there may be a lot of jobs for men, but no jobs for women. Yet, in other words, where you have unemployment because of the special situations of a particular area. The third area, of course, are the collective farms, agriculture, which still embraces almost half the population, and where you certainly still have a very low productivity. And one of the interesting phenomena, of course, is that one of the areas where there have been real gains in the past 5 years have been improving the economic status of the collective farmers vis-a-vis the urban population. So that where 5 years ago there were very powerful forces impelling people to move out of agriculture, simply because life was so much better in the cities. By making life better in the collective, in the agricultural area, by introducing such things as a guaranteed pay for collective farmers, pensions for collective farmers, trying to improve medical services in the rural areas and so on, they have slowed down the flow of excess labor from agriculture and industry. But as Nikita Khruschev said in a speech I heard in a hotel in Des Moines, Iowa, 10 years ago, agriculture is full of underemployed people. And there's no question but that Soviet agriculture, under the proper conditions, could very effectively give off 5, 10, 15 million people to other areas of the economy. So it's a very complicated economy, but it is certainly true that there is low productivity in many areas of the economy. And one of the things that's being done now, of course, in the new era of experimentation is the so-called Shchekino experiment. Shchekino is the name of a place with a chemical factory, where they've introduced a scheme where they're now firing people. They're getting rid of people they don't need. And the motivation there is that under the scheme that when you get rid of the people you don't need, you save money on their salaries. And the money that you save on their salaries, part of that money you save on salary is divided among the rest of the workforce. You see? As a reward for increased productivity. But productivity is still low, even though it has improved. The point, the Soviet Union, as an American sees it, certainly as I've seen it, is still a pretty slobby country. And I don't mean that to be offensive. I simply mean in terms of low productivity, of using labor in lots of places where we just couldn't afford to use labor. And of course, one of the reasons is that the average Soviet worker is earning $25 or $30 a week. Well, he's giving you $25 or $30 a week productivity too.
Another listener had this question. Do you feel that this tremendous desire for material gain and industrialization will cause a decentralization of the economy?
Well, my own feeling is that the Russians, like ourselves, are driven by very similar forces. In other words, if you want to get an American standard of living in any country, you've got to do certain things. You've got to build factories, for example. You've got to have mines. You've got to have oil wells, etc. In other words, I think there really is a convergence, because if you want the same things, the technological imperatives force you along certain lines, and I think those technological imperatives bring with them sociological and economic imperatives as well, which doesn't mean you have to have absolute similarity. Of course, you don't have to have identity. But it simply is true that if you want to have an efficient economy, you've got to pay attention to the most efficient method of investing your capital, because capital is scarce in all societies. You've got to pay attention to productivity. You've got to pay attention to motivation. You've got to pay attention to rationality. And in the modern world, you've even got to pay attention to mathematical economics. In other words, I think that in a very real sense, Adam Smith and Karl Marx, distinguished and wonderful as these people are really, in many respects, quite irrelevant to our modern problems, because well, if we ought to learn anything now, it really doesn't matter who owns resources. What matters is who controls their use. Whether the control is by means of a state planning committee order or whether it's by means of a law requiring this or that, which is the technique we use. And that is that ownership, beneficial ownership, in the sense of a guy who owns a share of stock and gets a dividend, if he gets a dividend, it really has very little influence. And that both the United States and the Soviet Union increasingly become bureaucratic industrial empires. And the problems are, how do you manage a bureaucracy efficiently and with maximum feedback from those who are supposed to be the beneficiaries? Okay?
And finally, someone asked, where will they find the market for the 600,000 Fiats they're going to build?
Oh, in the Soviet Union, most of them. You see, one of the problems in the Soviet Union is that there is inflationary pressure, and has been for a long time. There's lots of money around. The problem is getting goods. I don't mean to suggest that this is a economy where people are starving to death or anything of the sort, but I'm merely saying that traditionally the Soviet Union has been starved of consumer goods. The automobiles, there will be plenty of money. People do have in the Soviet Union money. They've been saving to buy their automobiles. I should guess that there won't be any trouble. It's a country of 240 million people. Remember, the United States, we sell 9 or 10 million automobiles a year in a population of 200 million. I don't see why the Soviet Union can't sell 600,000 cars a year in a population that's 20% greater. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
You have been listening to another in a series of lectures given on the campus of Iowa State University in Ames. Today you heard the second in a series of 8 lectures from the 1969 Institute on World Affairs, the USSR, the Second Half Century. The speaker was Harry Schwartz, a member of the editorial board of the New York Times and a specialist on Soviet affairs, discussing the Soviet economy since Khruschev. Next week, Alexander P. Evstafiev from the Soviet Embassy talks about Vladimir I. Lenin. University Lecture is a presentation of Iowa State University Radio.